When a struggling mother lost her newborn child during delivery, the crushing weight of grief left her desperate for one final moment with her baby at the hospital morgue. But what she discovered there, her supposedly deceased infant lying next to a healthy baby and a doctor's suspicious behavior, would shatter everything she believed about her child's death. This chance encounter would unveil a sinister plot that went far beyond a simple medical tragedy, one that would test a mother's love and determination to uncover the truth. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The night was chaotic as 28-year-old Eloise Carter was wheeled through the sterile corridors of the hospital. Her screams of labor pain echoed off the walls, causing other patients and visitors to turn their heads in concern. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of the paramedics as they rushed her towards the labor and delivery ward. Eloise gripped the sides of the gurney, her knuckles white with tension. Each contraction felt like a tidal wave of pain, crashing over her with increasing intensity. She had always imagined this moment differently, calm, prepared, with her boyfriend Corey by her side. Instead, she was alone, terrified and completely overwhelmed. As they burst through the double doors of the labor and delivery unit, Dr. Alan Greaves was already waiting, his face a mask of professional concern. He quickly assessed the situation, barking orders to the nurses around him. "Get her into room 3, he commanded. "I want fetal monitors set up immediately. Where's her chart?" A nurse hurried forward with a clipboard, which Dr. Greaves snatched and began scanning rapidly. Eloise tried to focus on his face, seeking reassurance, but another contraction hit, causing her to cry out in agony. "Ms. Carter," Dr. Greaves said, his voice cutting through her pain. "I'm Dr. Greaves. We're going to take good care of you and your baby. Just try to breathe through the contractions, okay?" Eloise nodded weakly, trying to remember the breathing exercises she'd learned in her prenatal classes. It all seemed so distant now, lost in the fog of pain and fear. The paramedics efficiently transferred her from the gurney to the hospital bed, their movements well practiced and smooth. As soon as she was settled, nurses swarmed around her, attaching monitors and checking her vitals. Dr. Greaves turned to the assembled staff. "All right, I want everyone out except Nurse Olivia," he said firmly. The other nurses exchanged glances but complied, filing out of the room with the paramedics. Only one nurse remained, a young woman with kind eyes and a nervous energy about her. "Are you sure, Doctor?" Nurse Olivia asked hesitantly. "This is my first solo work in the labor room." Dr. Greaves's expression softened slightly. "Don't worry, Olivia. This is your chance, your opportunity. Just follow my instructions and you'll do fine." As the others left, taking the gurney with them, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What had been a chaotic flurry of activity now became an intimate scene of 3. Eloise in increasing pain, Dr. Greaves maintaining clinical control, and Nurse Olivia providing emotional support. Olivia moved to Eloise's side, grasping her hand. "Try to steady your breathing," she encouraged, her voice calm despite her own nervousness. "That's it. In and out. You're doing great." Eloise clung to Olivia's hand like a lifeline, trying to focus on her breathing as another contraction built. The pain was like nothing she had ever experienced before, seeming to consume her entire being. Dr. Greaves positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his expression focused as he assessed Eloise's progress. "You're at 8 centimeters, Ms. Carter," he informed her. "It won't be long now. When you feel the urge to push, let us know." Time seemed to stretch and compress in strange ways. Eloise lost track of how long she had been there, caught in an endless cycle of pain and brief respites. Nurse Olivia remained by her side, offering words of encouragement and wiping her brow with a cool cloth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Eloise felt a new sensation, an overwhelming urge to push. I think it's time," she gasped between contractions. Dr. Greaves nodded, positioning himself. "All right, Eloise, when the next contraction comes, I want you to push with everything you've got. Nurse Olivia, support her back." As the contraction built, Eloise bore down, a primal scream tearing from her throat. She pushed with all her might, feeling as though she was being torn in two. "Good, good," Dr. Greaves encouraged. "The baby's head is crowning. Dr. Greaves announced after what felt like hours. "Eloise, I need you to push now." Eloise gritted her teeth, summoning her strength for a push, but as the baby's shoulder began to emerge, her strength began failing. She felt exhausted, the pain overwhelming her ability to continue. "Keep pushing, Eloise," Dr. Greaves urged. "You've entered the second stage of labor. We need to get this baby out." But Eloise couldn't muster the strength. Her pushes became weaker, her breath coming in short gasps. Dr. Greaves's brow furrowed as he assessed the situation. "We may have a stalled labor," he said, his voice tight with concern. "This could risk bleeding and may harm both mother and baby. We need to intervene." He turned to Nurse Olivia. "Prepare a Pitocin drip. We need to strengthen her contractions." As Olivia hurried to comply, Dr. Greaves explained to Eloise, "We're going to give you medication to help augment your labor. If that's not sufficient, we may need to consider vacuum extraction. Do I have your consent?" Eloise, barely able to focus through the pain, nodded weakly. "Anything," she gasped. "Just help me." The Pitocin was administered, but instead of helping, it seemed to intensify Eloise's pain without progressing the labor. Dr. Greaves' expression grew more concerned. "We need to move to vacuum extraction," he decided. "Nurse Olivia, prepare the vacuum extractor." As Olivia readied the equipment, Dr. Greaves turned back to Eloise. "I'm going to give you a pain relief medication," he explained. "It will help manage the pain and relax you, but I'll need you to push on your next contraction. We'll use the vacuum to assist, pulling when you push and pausing when you pause. Do you understand?" Eloise nodded, desperate for any relief. As the medication entered her system, she felt a wave of relaxation wash over her. The pain receded to a dull roar, allowing her to focus on Dr. Greaves's instructions. "All right, Eloise," Dr. Greaves said, positioning the vacuum extractor. "On your next contraction, push with everything you have." With one final monumental effort, Eloise pushed. She felt a strange sliding sensation, and then... The absence of her baby's cry was deafening. Eloise looked up, panic rising in her chest. "Why isn't he crying?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "What's wrong?" Dr. Greaves was working quickly, his face a mask of concentration as he pat the baby's thigh. "Nurse Olivia, get the resuscitation equipment ready, we might need it," he ordered, his voice tense. Eloise tried to sit up to see what was happening, but found herself suddenly overcome with dizziness. The room seemed to be spinning, voices becoming distant and muffled. "Doctor, she's losing a lot of blood," she heard Nurse Olivia say, her voice sounding far away. "Stay with us, Eloise," Dr. Greaves's voice cut through the fog. "We're going to give you something to help with the bleeding and the pain. Just hold on." She felt a warmth spreading through her veins. Medication of some kind. The pain began to recede, but with it went her awareness. Eloise tried to ask about her baby, to demand answers, but her tongue felt heavy in her mouth. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Dr. Greaves's voice saying, "That's it." But whether he was talking to her or about the baby, she couldn't tell. As consciousness slipped away, Eloise's final thought was of her child. Had she heard a cry? Had there been any sign of life? The questions swirled in her mind as she drifted into oblivion, the beeping of monitors and the urgent voices of Dr. Greaves and Nurse Olivia fading into silence. Eloise's return to consciousness was gradual, her senses slowly coming back online. The harsh lighting of the labor room had been replaced by softer illumination, filtering through standard hospital curtains. The space felt emptier, more impersonal, lacking both medical equipment and, most notably, her baby. As awareness fully returned, Eloise became acutely aware of the heaviness in her limbs, likely a lingering effect of the medication. She tried to orient herself, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar room. The absence of her child hit her like a physical blow, anxiety mounting with each passing second. With trembling fingers, Eloise reached for the SOS button near her bed. The wait for a response felt interminable, her heart racing as scenarios played out in her mind. Finally, the door opened, and a nurse entered. It wasn't Olivia, but a different nurse, her steps measured and her expression carefully composed. "Where's my baby?" Eloise asked, her voice hoarse and desperate. The nurse's professional demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the weight of the news she had to deliver. She approached Eloise's bedside, her voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Carter, I'm so sorry. Your baby didn't survive." The words hit Eloise like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She struggled to sit up, frustration mounting as she found herself still confined by IV lines and medical restraints. "No," she gasped. "No, that can't be right. I gave birth to him. I need to see him. I need to speak to the doctor." The nurse placed a comforting hand on Eloise's arm. "I understand. I'll call Dr. Greaves right away. Try to stay calm, Miss Carter. I'll be right back." As the nurse left, Eloise found herself alone in the room again, her mind racing. She tried to piece together her last conscious moments, fixating on Dr. Greaves's final words. "That's it." The phrase echoed in her mind as she struggled to remember if she had heard her baby cry. The medication's lingering effects blurred the line between memory and imagination, leaving her uncertain of crucial details. Had there been a cry? A moment of life before it was snatched away? Or had there been only silence? Eloise's hand moved to her now empty belly, a sob catching in her throat. She had carried this child for 9 months, felt every kick, every hiccup. How could it all end like this, in a sterile hospital room, with no chance to even hold her baby? As she waited for Dr. Greaves, Eloise's grief mingled with a growing sense of confusion. Something felt off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The uncertainty only added to her distress, leaving her feeling adrift in a sea of loss and unanswered questions. The morning light filtered through the hospital room's window, casting an almost ethereal glow that contrasted sharply with the grim reality of the situation. Eloise lay in her bed, her body aching and her mind foggy from the ordeal she had endured. The room felt sterile and impersonal, a stark reminder of the loss she had suffered. The door creaked open, and Eloise's heart leapt into her throat as she saw Dr. Greaves enter, followed closely by Nurse Olivia. The nurse carried a small, white-wrapped bundle in her arms, and Eloise felt a surge of conflicting emotions, hope, fear, and a deep, aching sadness. Dr. Greaves approached her bedside, his face a mask of professional composure. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice gentle but clinical, "how are you feeling this morning?" Eloise struggled to find her voice, her throat dry and raw from her earlier screams. I don't know," she managed to whisper. "Where's my baby? Please, I need to see him. The nurse earlier said... Dr. Greaves exchanged a glance with Nurse Olivia before nodding solemnly. "Of course," he said. "Nurse Olivia has brought him for you." As Nurse Olivia stepped forward, Eloise's world narrowed to the small bundle in her arms. With trembling hands, she reached out, and Olivia carefully transferred the weight of the infant into her embrace. The moment Eloise held her child, she knew something was terribly wrong. The bundle felt too light, too still. With shaking fingers, she pulled back the blanket, and a gasp escaped her lips. The baby's skin was a deep, unnatural purple, his tiny features frozen in an eternal stillness. His body was ice-cold against her warm skin, a stark reminder that this was not a living child, but one who had already been in the morgue. Tears welled up in Eloise's eyes as she traced her finger along her son's cheek. The skin felt waxy and unreal beneath her touch. This moment, which should have been filled with joy and the miracle of new life, was instead a heartbreaking encounter with death. "What happened?" Eloise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her child's face, trying to memorize every detail, even in its unnatural state. Dr. Greaves cleared his throat, his words flowing with practiced precision. "It was a boy," he began, his tone professional but with a hint of sympathy. "There were complications immediately after birth. His heart rate dropped dangerously low, and despite our best efforts at resuscitation, we were unable to revive him." Eloise nodded numbly, her mind struggling to process the information. She looked up at Dr. Greaves, her eyes searching his face for answers. "But why is he so purple?" she asked. "And he's so cold. How long has it been?" Dr. Greaves shifted uncomfortably, exchanging another quick glance with Nurse Olivia. You were unconscious for about 4 hours after the delivery, he explained. Given the circumstances, we had to move him to the morgue shortly after, which explains his current condition. The word morgue hit Eloise like a physical blow. Her baby, the child she had carried and loved for 9 months, had been alone in that cold, sterile place while she was unconscious. The thought was almost too much to bear. "I'm truly sorry for your loss, Ms. Carter," Dr. Greaves added, his voice softening slightly. Eloise barely heard him, her attention focused entirely on her son. She traced the curve of his nose, the shape of his lips, trying to imagine what he might have looked like, alive and healthy. Would he have had her eyes, her smile? Can I have some time alone with him?" she asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Greaves hesitated, his professional demeanor slipping for just a moment. "Of course," he said after a pause, "but I'm afraid I must insist that Nurse Olivia remain. It's hospital policy for safety reasons. We've had unpleasant cases in the past with traumatic patients." The contrast between his clinical detachment and Eloise's raw grief created a palpable tension in the room. As Dr. Greaves made his exit, the atmosphere shifted, becoming heavy with unspoken emotions. Nurse Olivia moved closer, her presence a silent offer of support. Eloise barely noticed her, lost in her own world of grief and memories. "I had so many dreams for you," Eloise whispered to her son, her voice choked with tears. "I imagined your first smile, your first steps. I wondered what your voice would sound like, what kind of person you'd grow up to be." As she spoke, her mind wandered back to the early days of her pregnancy. "You know," she said, her voice trembling, "I was so scared when I first found out about you. It wasn't an easy time in my life." Nurse Olivia listened silently, her face a mask of compassion as Eloise continued to open up. "My ex-husband, he kept coming back into my life years after our divorce. I was afraid, unsure if I could do this. But then, as time passed, I fell in love with you. I started to dream of our future together." Eloise's fingers continued to trace her son's features, memorizing every detail. The room felt suspended in time, the outside world fading away as mother and child shared this final, heartbreaking moment together. "The father," Nurse Olivia began hesitantly, her voice soft and uncertain. "Was it your ex-husband, ma'am?" Eloise looked up, a sad smile on her face. "It's complicated," she said simply. "Very complicated." Nurse Olivia nodded, not pushing for more information. Instead, she moved closer, offering silent support as Eloise continued to hold her son. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Eloise alternated between quiet tears and whispered words of love to her child. She told him about the nursery she had prepared, the toys she had bought, the future she had imagined for them. As the morning light grew stronger, casting long shadows across the room, Eloise felt a shift in the atmosphere. The finality of the moment began to settle in, the reality that soon she would have to let her son go forever. Just as this thought crossed her mind, there was a soft knock at the door. Dr. Greaves re-entered, his face solemn. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his tone gentle but firm, "but if you're ready, we need to take the baby back to the morgue." Eloise's arms tightened instinctively around her son. "Already?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Greaves nodded, a flicker of sympathy crossing his face. "I know it's hard, but it's necessary. We'll take good care of him, I promise." With a heavy heart, Eloise placed one last kiss on her baby's cold forehead. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered, her tears falling onto his still face. "Mama loves you so much." With gentle hands, Nurse Olivia took the baby from Eloise's arms. The loss of his weight left Eloise feeling empty, as if a part of her had been torn away. As Nurse Olivia held the baby, Dr. Greaves turned his attention to Eloise. He performed a perfunctory check of her vitals while explaining postpartum care expectations. "We'll give you a take-home kit and some medication to manage the pain and prevent infection," he said. "You should expect some postpartum bleeding, but it should reduce over the next 24 hours. Normal bleeding, like a period, is expected for a week or more." Eloise nodded numbly, only half listening as the doctor continued his instructions. Before leaving, Dr. Greaves turned to Nurse Olivia. Give her the remaining medication before she's discharged, he instructed. I'll take care of the baby. Nurse Olivia passed the baby to Dr. Greaves carefully, and as he left the room, Nurse Olivia turned back to Eloise, her voice gentle as she began to explain the emotional challenges ahead. There's something you should be prepared for, she said softly. Your body doesn't know that. Well, it will still produce breast milk. Eloise felt a fresh wave of grief wash over her at this cruel reminder of what should have been. Olivia continued, her voice filled with compassion. It should stop within 2 to 3 weeks without the baby taking it. There's an anti-clog supplement that can help if it becomes painful. The doctor didn't prescribe it, but you can request it as an additional purchase from the pharmacy if needed. Nurse Olivia helped Eloise sit up on the bed, gently reminding her to move cautiously and avoid strenuous activities to aid her recovery. After handing her the morning medication, an ibuprofen and an antibiotic, Olivia mentioned that Eloise could leave the hospital whenever she felt ready after she finished her current IV drip, which only little remained, and she might find it more restful at home. However, as Eloise considered going home, a sudden realization hit her. She had arrived in such a rush that she was without any personal belongings, not even the bare essentials. My phone, Eloise said suddenly. I remember having it when I came in last night. Do you know where it is? Nurse Olivia nodded, moving to a secure cabinet in one of the shelves. Another nurse secured it here last night, she explained, retrieving the device. As Eloise took her phone, it felt like a tangible link to the outside world she must soon face, a world that now felt irrevocably changed. Eloise switched on her phone, relieved to see it still had plenty of battery life. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face in the softly lit hospital room, casting shadows that accentuated the exhaustion etched into her features. As she scrolled through the missed calls and messages, the reality of her situation began to sink in anew. Nurse Olivia approached near the head of the bed, her footsteps soft on the linoleum floor. With practiced hands, she removed the IV infusion from Eloise's arm, the now empty bag hanging limp on the stand beside the bed. There you go, Olivia said gently, pressing a small cotton ball to the insertion site. Eloise flexed her arm, wincing slightly at the soreness, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke. Everything feels surreal. I was with child, but now I don't. Olivia nodded sympathetically, her kind eyes filled with understanding. That's perfectly normal after what you've been through. Is there anyone coming to pick you up? Family or friends? Eloise shook her head, a wave of loneliness washing over her. No, I'll just take a taxi. Concern flickered across Olivia's face. Are you sure? I'd be happy to help with the taxi fare if you need, since you don't have your bag. No, thank you, Eloise interrupted gently, managing a small, grateful smile. I have money at home, or I can pay from my phone. I appreciate the offer, though. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, if you're sure. Just remember, it's okay to accept help sometimes. She began gathering her things, preparing to leave. I'll be going now, but if you need anything... Wait! Eloise called out suddenly, surprising even herself with the urgency in her voice. Olivia turned back, her eyebrows raised in question. Eloise took a deep breath, her heart pounding. The request she was about to make felt simultaneously crucial and impossible. I need to ask you something, she began, her voice trembling. Olivia moved closer to the bed, her full attention on Eloise. What is it? I didn't have enough time, Eloise said, the words tumbling out in a rush. To say goodbye, I mean. Is there any way I could see my baby one last time before I leave? I'd like to take a picture with him. Her voice broke on the last words, tears welling up in her eyes. Please, it would mean so much to me. The compassion in Olivia's eyes was tempered with hesitation. Oh, Eloise, she said softly. I'm so sorry, but the baby has been taken to the morgue. We can't take patients there, and I don't have access. We'd need to contact the morgue staff. Eloise felt a wave of desperation wash over her. She reached out, grasping Olivia's hand. Please, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. This would be my last chance. If I had known where my phone was earlier, I would have taken a picture in the room. I need to keep something, a memory of him. Her words came faster now, tinged with urgency. Even if he didn't make it into this world, he was alive for 9 months inside me. Please, help me." Olivia's resolve visibly wavered, her professional demeanor cracking in the face of Eloise's raw emotion. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked softly. Eloise nodded emphatically, hope blooming in her chest. "I have to do this, please." After a moment of internal struggle, Olivia sighed. "I'll try to help," she said, "but I can't promise anything. This is against the hospital policy and should be off record." She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she typed out a message. The room fell silent save for the soft tapping of Olivia's fingers and Eloise's shaky breathing. Each second felt like an eternity as they waited for a response. Finally, Olivia's phone buzzed. She read the message, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Okay," she said after a moment, looking up at Eloise. "I think I can make this happen, but we need to be quick and discreet. Can you walk?" Eloise nodded, already pushing herself up from the bed. Her body protested, muscles sore and weak, but determination gave her strength. Olivia helped her into a robe, then led her out of the room. The hospital corridors seemed different now, quieter, more ominous. Their footsteps echoed softly as they made their way through the maze-like hallways, Olivia guiding them with purpose. Eloise's heart raced, a mix of anticipation and fear coursing through her veins. They paused outside the medical staff resting room, Olivia's eyes darting around nervously. A moment later, a woman in scrubs emerged, Olivia's friend from the morgue. The two spoke in hushed tones, their conversation a blur to Eloise's ears. All she could focus on was the access card the friend reluctantly handed over. "Return it as quickly as possible," the friend warned, her voice low and urgent. "This is against protocol. If anyone finds out—" Olivia nodded gratefully, tucking the card into her pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. "We'll be quick, I promise." As they continued their journey towards the morgue, the hospital seemed to transform around them. The cheerful paintings and motivational posters gave way to stark, unadorned walls. The air grew cooler, and an eerie silence settled over them. Eloise's mind raced with a mixture of grief and anticipation. She was about to see her son again, her beautiful boy who had been taken from her too soon. Part of her wondered if she was making a mistake, if seeing him again would only deepen her pain. But a stronger part knew that she needed this closure, this final moment with her child. They reached the morgue entrance, a heavy door with a keycard scanner. Olivia hesitated for just a moment before tapping the borrowed card. The lock clicked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. As Olivia pushed the door open, the cool air of the morgue washed over them. Eloise shivered. Whether from the temperature or from anticipation, she couldn't tell. They stepped inside, and then they both froze. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Dr. Greaves. He looked as surprised to see them as they were to see him. For a moment, nobody moved, the air thick with tension and unasked questions. Nurse Olivia was the first to recover. "I'm sorry, Doctor," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "There was no sign anyone was in here." Dr. Greaves cut her off, his voice sharp with authority and a hint of something else. Was it fear? "What are you doing here? Why have you brought a patient to the morgue without permission?" Before Olivia could respond, Eloise stepped forward. Despite her physical weakness, her voice was strong, fueled by a mother's determination. "It's not her fault," she said firmly. "I insisted on seeing my baby one last time. I just want a picture to remember him by." Dr. Greaves looked around nervously, seeming to realize they were alone. He appeared groggy, his usual composure slightly off-kilter. Eloise, focused on her mission, barely registered his odd behavior. Her gaze was drawn to the cold morgue table, where she saw her baby lying alongside another infant. The contrast was stark, her child's purple hue a sharp difference from the other baby's more natural coloring. The sight of her baby alongside another infant deepened Eloise's grief. Dr. Greaves, noticing Eloise's gaze, quickly moved to place the other baby in a box, closing it swiftly. "This one didn't make it either," he explained hastily, his words tumbling out. "We need to take it for examination." The atmosphere in the room had shifted. charged with an undercurrent of tension and unspoken suspicions. As Eloise stood there, her eyes fixed on her child on the table, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But for now, all she could focus on was this moment, this last precious time with her son. Dr. Greaves hurriedly picked up the box containing the other baby, his movements jerky and uncharacteristically clumsy. "Don't linger too long," he warned, his tone a mix of authority and barely concealed nervousness. "You're not supposed to be here. I'll make an exception this once, but—" He paused, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Eloise. "I truly am sorry for your loss." As Dr. Greaves rushed out of the room, the heavy door closing behind him with a dull thud, Eloise found herself alone with Nurse Olivia and her son. The silence in the morgue was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigeration units. With trembling hands, Eloise approached the cold metal table where her baby lay. The stark contrast between the warmth of her skin and the icy chill of her son's body sent a shiver through her. Gently, reverently, she lifted him into her arms, cradling him against her chest as she had imagined doing so many times during her pregnancy. "Olivia," Eloise said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "could you please take a picture for me?" Nurse Olivia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she took Eloise's phone. The camera's flash illuminated the room for a brief moment, capturing the heart-wrenching image of mother and child in this final, bittersweet reunion. As Olivia took several more photos from different angles, Eloise's focus remained entirely on her son. She traced the curve of his nose, the shape of his lips, committing every detail to memory. Despite the unnatural purple hue of his skin, she could see hints of herself in his features. "You're so beautiful," Eloise whispered, her tears falling softly onto her baby's still face. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry we didn't have more time." The weight of her grief felt crushing. Reluctantly, knowing their time was limited, Eloise placed one last lingering kiss on her son's forehead. "Goodbye, my love," she murmured, her voice breaking. With great effort, she handed him back to Nurse Olivia, who gently returned him to the open freezer box before closing it. As they prepared to leave the morgue, Eloise turned to Olivia, her eyes red-rimmed but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for putting you in this position." Olivia shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "Actually, I'm not that surprised," she admitted, her voice soft in the quiet room. "My friend in the morgue has told me several times that grieving mothers often request to see their babies and take pictures. It might sound morbid to some, but it's a reality for many patients. I understand the need for closure." "Well, usually they bring the baby to the hospital room, but I understood. Your time earlier was so limited." They made their way out of the morgue, the door closing behind them with a sense of finality. The hospital corridors seemed brighter now, almost glaringly so after the dimness of the morgue. As they walked, Eloise found herself lost in thought, her mind replaying the events of last night over and over. "Usually they bring the baby to the hospital room, but I understood. Your time earlier was so limited." "Let's get you to the front desk to complete the discharge paperwork," Olivia said gently, guiding Eloise through the maze-like hallways. At the administration desk, Eloise explained her situation to the staff member, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I don't have my wallet. I was brought in as an emergency." The staff member nodded understandingly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "No problem. We'll send the bill to your address. Just fill out this registration form for now." As Eloise mechanically filled out the paperwork, her hand gliding across the page, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. She was sure she was overlooking something important. Yet, the dull ache in her head and the fog of lingering medication kept her from focusing long enough to figure out what it was. Once the forms were filled out, the staff member handed Eloise a small bag containing her medication, take-home kit, and discharge instructions. "Take care, Ms. Carter," she said kindly. "And again, we're so sorry for your loss." Eloise nodded numbly, clutching the bag to her chest like a lifeline. She turned to Nurse Olivia, who had stayed by her side throughout the process. "Thank you for everything," she said softly. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Olivia squeezed her arm gently. "You're stronger than you know, Eloise. Take care of yourself and don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything." With a final goodbye to Nurse Olivia, Eloise stepped out of the hospital and into the bright afternoon sunlight. The world seemed too loud, too colourful, too alive in stark contrast to the grief that weighed heavily on her heart. She made her way to the taxi stand, her steps slow and unsteady. As she waited for a cab, she pulled out her phone, the weight of it in her hand, a reminder of the precious photos it now contained. She scrolled through her missed calls and messages, her heart clenching as she saw several from her boyfriend Corey and her work colleagues, all asking where she was and if everything was okay. The task of explaining what had happened felt overwhelming. How could she possibly put into words the joy, fear, pain, and devastating loss she had experienced in the past 24 hours? In the end, she sent only a brief message to Corey. "Something's happened. I'll explain everything when you have time to call. I need to talk to you." As a taxi pulled up, Eloise climbed in, giving her home address in a voice that sounded strange to her own ears. As the car pulled away from the curb, she leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. Outside the window, life continuing as normal for everyone else, while Eloise's world had been irrevocably changed. She closed her eyes, one hand resting protectively over her now empty womb, the other clutching her phone with its precious cargo of final memories. The taxi pulled up to Eloise's apartment building, the familiar facade now seeming strangely alien. Eloise fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she completed the mobile transfer to pay the driver. As the car pulled away, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling oddly disconnected from her surroundings. Taking a deep breath, Eloise pushed open the heavy glass door of the building's entrance. The lobby, with its faux marble floors and generic potted plants, felt surreal after the sterile environment of the hospital. Her footsteps echoed in the empty space as she made her way to the elevator. Inside the elevator, Eloise caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored wall. Her reflection startled her. Pale face, dark circles under her eyes, hair limp and tangled. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. As the elevator ascended, she closed her eyes, trying to center herself for what lay ahead. The soft ding of the elevator reaching her floor jolted Eloise back to the present. She stepped out into the hallway, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. The walk to her apartment door seemed to take an eternity, each step a monumental effort. As she entered her apartment, the silence hit her like a physical force. The space that had once felt cozy and full of promise now seemed to echo with emptiness. Her gaze fell on the corner, where she had collapsed in labor pain just the night before. The memory felt both recent and impossibly distant, as if it had happened to someone else. Eloise made her way to her bedroom, her steps heavy and slow. The sight that greeted her there brought a fresh wave of grief crashing over her. Next to her bed stood the carefully prepared bassinet, its soft blankets and stuffed animals, a cruel reminder of the future that would never come to pass. Nearby sat her hospital bag, packed a month ago with such hope and excitement. Eloise approached it slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. With trembling hands, she unzipped the bag, revealing its contents. Tiny onesies, diapers, a breast pump, a coming-home outfit she had chosen with such care. Each item was a dagger to her heart, a tangible reminder of her loss. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Eloise sank onto her bed, overwhelmed by the quiet of the apartment. It amplified her solitude, forcing her to confront the magnitude of her loss. As the medication's effects continued to fade, she became acutely aware of her body's discomfort and the gnawing pangs of hunger. Forcing herself to her feet, Eloise made her way to the kitchen. She opened the fridge, the cool air washing over her as she surveyed its contents. Her eyes fell on a container of leftover dinner, the one she had yesterday before the emergency, and she grabbed it mechanically, barely registering her actions as she transferred it to a plate and placed it in the microwave. Eloise leaned against the counter, her mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts and memories. The sharp ding of the microwave finishing startled her, and she jumped slightly, her nerves raw and frayed. Eloise carried her plate to the living room, settling onto the couch. She ate without tasting, her movements robotic as she lifted the fork to her mouth again and again. With her physical hunger somewhat sated, Eloise found herself drawn back to her phone. She opened the gallery, her finger hovering over the folder containing the photos taken in the morgue. Taking a deep breath, she tapped on the first image. The sight of her son, so still and perfect in her arms, brought fresh tears to her eyes. As she swiped through the photos, studying each one intently, details began nagging at her consciousness. She remembered the other baby in the morgue, the one Dr. Greaves had quickly hidden away. Why had it been laid out next to her son? And why had her deceased baby not been in a freezer box to begin with? As the fog of medication lifted further from her mind, more questions arose. Why had her baby looked so purple compared to the other infant? If they had both passed away recently, as Dr. Greaves implied, shouldn't they have looked similar? But as quickly as these thoughts surfaced, Eloise pushed them away. Surely her mind was playing tricks on her, grief and trauma distorting her perceptions. Doctors were held to high moral standards. They wouldn't do anything unethical. Would they? Shaking her head to clear these unsettling thoughts, Eloise made her way to the bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the small space as she undressed. As she stepped under the hot water, she felt the tension in her muscles begin to ease slightly. She stood there for a long time, letting the water wash over her, imagining it could somehow cleanse her of her grief and confusion. As the steam cleared from the mirror, Eloise found herself staring at her reflection, her eyes drawn to the features she had always taken for granted. She reached for her phone, which she had left on the bathroom counter, and opened the gallery once more. This time, as she looked at the photos of her baby, something struck her that she hadn't noticed before. The baby's features, the black hair, the shape of the nose, the curve of the mouth, they were markedly different from her own. She tried to remember the other baby more clearly, a nagging feeling that its hair had been fair. A chill ran down her spine as the realization hit her. Heart-pounding, Eloise rushed out of the bathroom, barely remembering to wrap a towel around herself. She made her way to the living room, where a large cabinet stood against the wall. With trembling hands, she pulled open one of the drawers and rifled through it until she found what she was looking for, a large A4 envelope. She took the envelope to her bedroom, scattering its contents across the bed. Papers spilled out, and Eloise began to frantically scan through them, searching for one document in particular, the sperm donor profile. As she read, memories flooded back. She and Corey had spent hours poring over donor profiles, carefully selecting criteria that matched their own characteristics. Corey's medical condition meant he couldn't father a child, but they had wanted the baby to resemble them both as much as possible. One of the key criteria they had insisted on was blonde hair, like both of them had. Her eyes locked onto the relevant section of the document. There it was, in black and white. Hair color, blonde. Eloise felt her world tilt on its axis. How could her baby have had such dark hair if the donor was blonde? Her mind raced with possibilities. Had there been a mix-up at the fertility clinic? Had she been given a different donor's sperm than the one she and Corey had chosen? The implications were staggering. Just as the weight of these new questions threatened to overwhelm her, Eloise was hit with a wave of physical discomfort. A sharp pain radiated through her abdomen and breast, reminding her of her postpartum state. She winced, one hand going to her stomach as she tried to steady her breathing. The pain brought her back to the present moment, to the reality of her physical needs. She remembered Nurse Olivia mentioning an anti-clog supplement for breast milk production. In her emotional state at the hospital, she had forgotten to request it. Deciding she needed to address this, she put the papers back in the envelope. Eloise quickly dried off and dressed. The idea of leaving her apartment again and back to the hospital so soon filled her with anxiety. But she knew she needed to take care of herself, if only for the sake of her lost child. She gathered her bag, double-checking that she had her phone and keys. As she was about to leave, her gaze fell on a framed ultrasound picture on her bedside table. The sight of it made her pause, a lump forming in her throat. After a moment's hesitation, she picked it up and slipped it into her bag. It felt wrong to leave without some tangible reminder of her son. Eloise stepped into the elevator, the faint hum of its descent echoing in the enclosed space as her thoughts fixated on returning to the hospital for the supplement she had forgotten. The mirrored walls reflected her pale, drawn face, and she smoothed her hair as if tidying her appearance might bring some semblance of control to the day. Once in the lobby, she opened her phone, navigating to her taxi app with practiced efficiency. The glow of the phone illuminated her face, and her brow furrowed slightly as she glanced at the fare estimate. It wasn't cheap, and for a moment she hesitated. The anti-clog supplement wasn't exclusive to the hospital pharmacy. Any well-stocked drugstore would carry it, and she could save time and money by heading to one closer to home. The logical solution was clear, but Eloise found herself lingering, her thumb hovering over the "Confirm Ride" button. The hospital's stark, sterile corridors flickered in her mind, tugging at her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just the supplement, it was something else. A faint but persistent pull, like a whisper she couldn't ignore. Perhaps she would find more answers about her nagging questions about her baby's passing. She tapped the button. The screen flashed a confirmation, and her ride was on its way. The decision didn't feel entirely practical, but she dismissed the thought, rationalizing it as convenience. As the minutes ticked by, she wandered toward the mailroom. A habitual check, she thought, more to kill time than anything else. The scent of paper and ink greeted her as she opened her mailbox, the metallic clink echoing softly. Among the usual clutter of bills and flyers was an envelope that stood out, plain, unmarked, and without a return address. Eloise picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, as if it contained more than a simple letter. Curiosity sparked, but she slipped it into her bag, deciding it could wait. Her cab would be here any moment. She returned to the lobby, adjusting her bag over her shoulder as she spotted the taxi pulling up to the curb outside. The crisp air greeted her as she stepped out, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't yet frame. Eloise climbed into the back seat, her focus shifting between the road ahead and the faint tug of the envelope against her side, both of them leading her back to the hospital. As the car pulled away from the curb, she reached into her bag for the mysterious envelope. She was about to open it when her phone suddenly rang. Eloise's heart skipped a beat as she saw Corey's name on the screen. Taking a deep breath, she answered the call. "Eloise?" Corey's voice came through, filled with worry. "What's going on? Why didn't you reply to any of my texts last night?" Eloise glanced at the taxi driver, acutely aware of his presence. Despite her discomfort at discussing such private matters in this setting, she knew Corey deserved an explanation. I went into emergency labor last night," she began, her voice trembling. "But, Corey, the baby, he didn't make it. They said it was heart failure." She could hear Corey's sharp intake of breath. "Oh, Eloise, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say. I was so far here at Vietnam on business and you were alone." Eloise continued, recounting the baby's condition as explained by the doctor and her interaction with Nurse Olivia, who had assisted her in visiting the morgue. She shared every detail, right up to realizing she'd forgotten the supplement and her current trip back to the hospital. As she spoke, she caught the taxi driver's gaze in the rearview mirror. His expression reflected a blend of sympathy, surprise, and unease, as though he wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm taking the first flight available," Corey said firmly. "I'll be there with you tomorrow, okay? Just hold on and take care of yourself until then. Call me if you need anything. I love you." After ending the call, Eloise felt emotionally drained. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city pass by in a blur. After a few moments, she remembered the envelope in her lap. With slightly trembling hands, she opened it. Inside, she found a love letter and a check. As she read the heartfelt words of encouragement and support for her and the baby, a small smile tugged at her lips, despite her grief. She had received similar letters throughout her pregnancy, always unsigned but clearly from Corey. It touched her that he had gone to such lengths to support her from afar. Touched by his thoughtfulness, Eloise took a picture of the letter with her phone. She composed a message to Corey. "This is the 10th anonymous letter you've sent me monthly since I got pregnant. I've known it was you all along, even though we kept quiet about it for so long. It's so thoughtful, but you don't need to keep doing this. Thank you for standing by us, even from afar. I still remember when you agreed to us having a baby through a donor, despite the challenges of our long-distance relationship. Can't wait to see you tomorrow." As she hit send, the taxi pulled up to the hospital entrance. Eloise paid the driver and stepped out, the familiar facade of St. Mary's looming before her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. With a mixture of determination and apprehension, she walked through the sliding doors, back into the place where her world had changed forever, just hours before. She headed straight for the pharmacy, intent on getting the anti-clog supplement Nurse Olivia had mentioned. At the pharmacy counter, Eloise placed her order and was directed to wait. Eloise turned to look at the waiting area, noticing the crowd of patients and visitors occupying most of the chairs. The thought of sitting among strangers, their curious glances and potential small talk, felt overwhelming. She needed space, quiet. "I think I'll walk around a bit," she murmured, more to herself than to the pharmacist. Her feet carried her almost unconsciously towards the maternity wing. The corridors here were quieter, the soft beeping of monitors and occasional cry of a newborn creating a surreal atmosphere. Eloise found herself drawn to the nursery window, her hand resting on the glass as she gazed at the rows of bassinets. Each tiny face she saw brought a fresh wave of grief, a reminder of what she had lost. But as she stood there, something else began to stir within her, a nagging doubt, a growing suspicion that something wasn't right about her own experience. Lost in her thoughts, Eloise almost missed the familiar figure striding purposefully down the hallway. It was Dr. Greaves, his white coat billowing slightly as he walked. Without really thinking about why, Eloise found herself following him at a distance, curiosity overriding her initial instinct to avoid him. She trailed Dr. Greaves through several corridors, always staying just far enough behind to avoid detection. As they turned a corner into a less busy area of the hospital, Eloise's heart nearly stopped. There, greeting Dr. Greaves with familiar warmth, was a face she had hoped never to see again, her ex-husband Michael. Eloise quickly ducked behind a supply cart, her pulse racing. What was Michael doing here? And how did he know Dr. Greaves? She strained to hear their conversation, catching only fragments of words spoken in low, conspiratorial tones. The two men entered a nearby room, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Eloise stood frozen, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just witnessed. The abusive ex-husband she had fought so hard to escape, somehow connected to the doctor who had delivered her supposedly stillborn child. It seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence before her eyes. As she debated whether to move closer, to try and overhear more, conflicting emotions warred within her. It had taken a court order and a hefty fine to finally keep Michael away from her. Only then had Eloise felt truly free, allowing her to meet and fall in love with Corey. The thought that Michael might be back in her life, even peripherally, made her feel sick. Fear of encountering Michael again battled with her growing determination to uncover the truth about her baby's death. This unexpected connection added another layer of mystery to an already confusing situation. Yet curiosity and a growing sense that something wasn't right compelled her forward. This was a public hospital, she reasoned. Michael couldn't do anything to her here, and if he was somehow involved in her care, she needed to know. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Eloise approached the room quietly. She positioned herself near the door, straining to hear the conversation inside. Just as she was about to lean closer, a hand grasped her arm, pulling her away. Eloise stepped back, her heart in her throat, only to find herself face to face with Nurse Olivia. "Mrs. Eloise, what are you doing here? I thought you went home," Olivia whispered, guiding Eloise away from the door and into a nearby empty room. "Please follow me. There's something I need to say." Once inside, Olivia's expression changed from concern to determination. "There's something you need to know, Mrs. Eloise," she said, her voice low and serious, yet anxious at the same time. It's about the medication Dr. Greaves used during your labor. I thought I wouldn't have the chance to see you again, but here you are. Eloise felt her stomach drop. What about it? What do you mean? You're starting to scare me, Nurse Olivia. Olivia took a deep breath. While I was cleaning up the labor room last night after you were moved, I noticed the empty medication bottles. The pain relief medication you were given. It was fentanyl, an opioid. Eloise's brow furrowed in confusion. Is that not normal? Sometimes opioids are used for pain relief during labor, Olivia explained, but the dose you were given was higher than standard protocol. She reached into her pocket, producing a small evidence bag containing an empty medication bottle. I kept this. I knew something wasn't right. Eloise stared at the bottle, her mind racing. What does this mean for me, for my baby? Olivia's expression was grim. Using opioids for labor pain can have negative effects on a baby's breathing. It can cause them to be unresponsive shortly after birth. The implications of Olivia's words hit Eloise like a physical blow. Are you saying this is why my baby died, not heart failure like Dr. Greaves said? Olivia shook her head quickly. It's unlikely that the baby died due to the opioid. Usually they're just very sleepy and don't wake up for a long time, but... She hesitated, clearly struggling with what to say next. What? Eloise pressed, her heart pounding. What aren't you telling me? Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you this morning. I was scared to speak up. I'm not as experienced as the other nurses, but I was in the room when your baby was born. He didn't cry and his heart rate was low. I didn't know about the fentanyl at the time. I was preparing the vacuum extractor when Dr. Greaves administered it. So when he declared the baby stillborn, I believed him. Eloise felt as though the floor was tilting beneath her feet. But you're not sure now? Olivia nodded. Earlier, when I saw the doctor carry that box out of the morgue, I had doubts. And then the morgue staff, who was my friend, said he hadn't returned the access card even till now. I became suspicious. Why would the examination of a stillborn baby take so long? Eloise's mind was reeling. She thought back to the morgue, to the two babies she had seen. Could it be possible? Was there a chance her son was still alive? Olivia, Eloise said, her voice shaking, I need your help. We have to find out what's really going on. If there's even a slight chance that my baby is alive or any foul play, I need to know. With renewed determination, Eloise and Olivia made their way back to the room where Michael and Dr. Greaves had entered. Eloise's heart raced as they approached, a mix of fear and hope churning in her stomach. We need to be careful, Olivia whispered. If what we suspect is true, they could be dangerous. Eloise nodded, her eyes fixed on the door. As they drew closer, she could hear muffled voices from inside. Cautiously, she peered through the small window in the door, and what she saw made her gasp. There in a hospital bassinet was a baby, very much alive and looking healthy. But it wasn't just any baby. The infant had blonde hair, just like Eloise's, and features that mirrored her own. It was a stark contrast to the dark-haired infant she had been shown in the morgue. "Oh my God!" Eloise breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Olivia, I think that's my baby." Olivia looked through the window, her eyes widening. "The fentanyl side effects must have worn off," she whispered. "The baby's awake now." Eloise felt a surge of anger and desperation as she saw Dr. Greaves handed the baby to Michael. "We have to get in there," she said, reaching for the door handle. But Olivia held her back. "Wait," she cautioned. "We need to be smart about this. If we burst in there, they might do something drastic. We need proof." Eloise nodded, forcing herself to think rationally despite the turmoil of emotions inside her. "You're right. But how?" Olivia thought for a moment. "The hospital records," she said suddenly. "If we can access them, we might be able to find evidence of what really happened." They hurried to the nearest nurses' station, Olivia's fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the hospital's database. Meanwhile, she pulled out her phone and called her friend in the morgue. "Lindsay, I need you to check something for me," Olivia said urgently into the phone. "The baby that was brought in last night, the one Dr. Greaves said was stillborn. Can you confirm the details?" As Olivia spoke with her friend, cross-referencing information, Eloise watched the computer screen, her heart pounding. After what felt like an eternity, Olivia turned to her face pale. "Eloise," she began gently, her voice soft but steady. "The records confirm it. The dark-haired baby in the morgue isn't yours. That child passed away 3 days ago. Your baby, the one with blonde hair, was admitted to the morgue just last night. But strangely, no freezer box was allocated for him. Instead, look here," she said, pointing to the data set. "He was placed in nursery room number 5. It's a room designated for rescued babies and is often left vacant." Eloise felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. The reality of what had happened, what was still happening, hit her like a physical blow. Her baby was alive, and Michael, her abusive ex-husband, was trying to steal him. "We need to call the police," Eloise said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "Right now." Olivia nodded, already dialing. "I'll do it," she said. "You stay here. Don't confront them yet. We need to let the authorities handle this." As Olivia spoke quietly but urgently to the police, Eloise's mind raced. How had Michael orchestrated this? Why was Dr. Greaves involved? And most importantly, how could she ensure her baby's safety? The wait for the police felt interminable, every second stretching out as Eloise imagined all the things that could go wrong. But finally, Olivia ended the call and turned to her. "They're on their way," she said. "They've advised us to stay put and not to confront Michael or Dr. Greaves. But Eloise, they're coming. We're going to get your baby back." Eloise nodded, tears of relief and anger mingling on her cheeks. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, she steeled herself for the confrontation to come. Her son was alive, and she was going to fight with everything she had to bring him home where he belonged. As they waited for the police to arrive, Eloise and Olivia cautiously made their way back to the room where Michael and Dr. Greaves were with the baby. They positioned themselves near the door, careful to stay out of sight while still being able to observe through the small window. Inside, Eloise could see Michael holding the baby, a triumphant smile on his face as he spoke to Dr. Greaves. The sight of her ex-husband with her child made her blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that rushing in could put her baby at risk. "I can't believe this is really happening," Eloise whispered to Olivia. "How could they do this?" Olivia squeezed her arm supportively. "I don't know, but we're going to make sure they don't get away with it. The police will be here soon." "That's my son," Eloise said, her voice breaking. "I can see it now. He looks just like me." Olivia nodded. The fentanyl side effects must have worn off completely. He looks perfectly healthy now. Just then they heard the sound of approaching footsteps and turned to see several police officers making their way down the corridor, led by a detective. The detective approached them, his expression serious. "Are you Eloise Carter?" he asked quietly. Eloise nodded, relief washing over her. "Yes, that's me. Please, my baby is in there with my ex-husband. He's trying to steal him." The detective nodded, motioning for his officers to take position. "We're going to handle this carefully," he assured her. "Can you tell me briefly what's happened?" Quickly, Eloise and Olivia explained the situation, the fentanyl overdose, the baby swap, and Michael's involvement. The detective listened intently, his frown deepening as he heard the details. "All right," he said finally. "We're going to go in now. Miss Carter, I need you to stay out here with one of my officers. Nurse, if you could come with us to help with the baby, that would be helpful." Eloise wanted to protest, to insist on going in herself, but she knew the detective was right. She nodded reluctantly, watching as the police prepared to enter the room. Eloise felt a surge of adrenaline. Despite the detective's earlier advice to stay back, she couldn't bear to be a passive observer any longer. When the officers moved to enter the room, Eloise followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The door burst open, and Eloise found herself face to face with Michael and Dr. Greaves. The shock on their faces quickly turned to anger as they realized they'd been caught. "What is the meaning of this?" Dr. Greaves sputtered, his usual composure cracking. Eloise stepped forward, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have evidence that this is my baby," she said, pointing to the infant in Michael's arms. "What are you doing here, Michael? And you, Dr. Greaves, What are you doing with my ex-husband? Dr. Greaves attempted to regain control of the situation. Eloise, you must be confused. You're still grieving. This is Michael's child. His wife just gave birth. That's a lie, Eloise interrupted. I remember this baby. You declared him dead and took him away in a box for examination. Nurse Olivia has confirmed that Michael isn't a registered patient, and his supposed wife isn't here either. Michael's face contorted with rage, but then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh. The sound sent chills down Eloise's spine. Oh, Eloise, he sneered, did you think you could ever truly be free of me? I see you've enjoyed all my checks these past 2 years. Did you like my love letters? How many of them did you keep? Eloise felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. What are you talking about? Those were from Corey. Michael's grin widened. You see, all these years you've lived off my money. I still took care of you, no matter what happened between us. That's just how much I love you. Eloise's mind raced. She pulled out her phone, checking Corey's earlier message. To her horror, she saw his reply stating he had never sent any letters or money. Fury rose within her, replacing her shock. She tore up the letter and check she had found earlier, throwing the pieces to the floor. It doesn't matter, she spat. You've been stalking me all this time. You're sick, Michael. Michael's demeanor changed, becoming cold and calculating. It doesn't matter now. I'm taking the child. He's rightfully mine. What are you talking about? Eloise demanded. This is my baby. Michael's next words hit her like a physical blow. I just borrowed your womb, he said smugly. The baby has my DNA. I'm the sperm donor. Eloise felt the world spinning around her. It can't be. You're making things up just to upset me, she said. How is that possible? Michael gloated, revealing the extent of his manipulation. I've always been watching you, Eloise. I have people everywhere. I knew about your fertility treatments, your plans. I managed to ensure the sperm donor you received was mine. Eloise felt sick, her mind reeling from the implications. I don't believe you, she said, her voice shaking. I want a DNA test. Michael laughed again. By all means, let's do a DNA test. But think about it, Eloise. You wouldn't have had this baby if you knew it was mine. This child is a curse to you now. What will Corey say? Eloise was stunned to realize that Michael knew about Corey. The depth of his surveillance over her life was chilling. What else did he know? Did he have cameras in her apartment as well? Eloise felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of violation. But as her eyes fell on the baby, now being gently taken by a female officer, she felt a fierce surge of love and protectiveness. The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Police officers moved swiftly, securing both Michael and Dr. Greaves. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place echoed in the suddenly quiet room. Michael Carter, Dr. Alan Greaves, you're under arrest, one of the officers announced, his voice firm and authoritative. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the Miranda rights were being read, Eloise's attention was drawn to her son. A female officer was carefully lifting the baby from the hospital bassinet, her movements gentle and practiced. The infant stirred slightly but didn't cry, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding around him. Ms. Carter, the officer said softly, approaching Eloise, would you like to hold your son? Eloise nodded, her arms already reaching out. As the warm weight of her baby settled against her chest, she felt a surge of emotions so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. This was real. Her son was alive, and he was back in her arms where he belonged. No matter what Michael had done, no matter whose DNA the baby carried, this was her child. She had carried him, loved him, and nearly lost him. As the reality of the situation sank in, Eloise knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was determined to face it head-on, for herself and for her son. Meanwhile, other officers were busy collecting evidence. One was carefully bagging the torn pieces of the letter and checked that Eloise had thrown to the floor earlier. Another was securing the fentanyl bottle from Nurse Olivia. One officer was photographing the room, paying particular attention to a briefcase that sat open on a nearby table. "Detective," another officer called out, "you might want to take a look at this." The lead detective moved to examine the contents of the briefcase. His eyebrows rose as he leafed through several documents. "Financial records," he murmured, loud enough for Eloise to hear. "Looks like a trail of payments from Mr. Carter to Dr. Greaves over the past year." Eloise felt her stomach churn at this confirmation of the conspiracy against her. She held her son tighter, as if to shield him from the ugly truth of his origins. "There's more," the detective continued, his voice grim. "Correspondence that suggests Mr. Carter has been monitoring Ms. Carter's fertility treatments for some time. And, this is interesting, documents related to the sperm donor selection process at the fertility clinic." Michael, who had been silent since his initial outburst, suddenly spoke up. "You can't prove anything," he snarled. "I have connections. This will never hold up in court." The detective turned to Michael, his expression hard. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Mr. Carter. We have quite a paper trail here, not to mention testimonies from hospital staff. You're looking at some very serious charges." As Michael was led out of the room, still shouting threats and promises of retribution, Eloise felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The nightmare was over, but the repercussions of Michael's actions were only beginning to unfold. Dr. Greaves, in contrast to Michael's belligerence, seemed to have crumpled in on himself. As an officer guided him towards the door, he turned to Eloise, his face a mask of shame and regret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go this far. The debt, my son's gambling problem. I didn't know what else to do." Eloise couldn't bring herself to respond. She watched in silence as Dr. Greaves and Michael were led away, feeling a complex mix of anger, pity, and disgust. The detective approached Eloise, his manner gentler now. "Ms. Carter, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a full statement. But if you want some time to process everything, we can arrange another time. You've been through quite an ordeal." Eloise looked down at her son, peacefully sleeping in her arms. The thought of being separated from him, even for a short time, made her heart clench. But she knew the importance of giving her statement quickly. Yes, I can do that," she said hesitantly. She turned to Nurse Olivia, who had been a constant support through this ordeal. "Olivia, would you—" Olivia stepped forward immediately, understanding Eloise's unspoken request. "Of course, I'll take care of him. He'll be safe with me, I promise." With great reluctance, Eloise gently transferred her son into Olivia's arms. She placed a soft kiss on his forehead, whispering, "Mommy will be back soon, little one." Then she turned to the nurse. "Thank you for everything, Nurse Olivia. It was not a coincidence that you were in the room last night helping me bring this little boy into the world." The detective led Eloise out of the hospital and into a waiting police car. As they drove through the evening streets, Eloise's mind raced. So much had happened in the past 24 hours, it felt like a lifetime had passed since she first arrived at the hospital in labor. At the police station, Eloise was led to an interview room. The detective offered her a cup of water before they began. "Take your time, Ms. Carter," he said kindly. "We want to get a full picture of everything that's happened, starting from your divorce 4 years ago." Eloise took a deep breath and began her story. She described her tumultuous marriage to Michael, the abuse she had endured, and the difficult divorce. She recounted the 2 years of terror that followed, with Michael stalking and harassing her despite court orders. "It was only after he was fined and given a strict restraining order that I finally felt free," Eloise explained, her voice trembling slightly. "That's when I met Corey, my current boyfriend. We've been together for almost 2 years now." The detective nodded, making notes. "And how does Corey fit into this situation with the baby?" Eloise hesitated, then decided complete honesty was the best approach. "Corey has a medical condition that prevents him from having children naturally. We decided to use a sperm donor for this pregnancy. Corey has been supportive throughout, even though he's currently overseas for work." As Eloise continued her story, detailing the events of her labor and the subsequent deception, the detective's frown deepened. When she mentioned the mysterious letters and checks she had been receiving, his eyebrows shot up. "Ms. Carter," he interrupted, Do you still have these letters? Eloise nodded. Yes, I have them at home. I thought they were from Corey, but now I'm not so sure. The detective made a note. We'll need to see those. They could be crucial evidence. As the interview progressed, Eloise felt emotionally drained but also relieved to be finally telling the whole story. The detective listened attentively, asking clarifying questions and ensuring every detail was recorded. Ms. Carter, the detective said as they neared the end of the interview, given Michael's history and the lengths he went to in this situation, we're concerned about your safety and the baby's. We'd like to arrange for protective custody until we can ensure Michael doesn't have any other plans in motion. Eloise felt a chill run down her spine at the thought of Michael potentially having more tricks up his sleeve. She nodded slowly. Whatever you think is best to keep my son safe. As the detective began to explain the protective custody arrangements, Eloise's phone buzzed. It was a message from Corey. Just board the plane. On my way to you now. How are you holding up? Eloise looked at the message, then back at the detective. So much had changed in the past few hours. How could she even begin to explain it all to Corey? Detective, she said, her voice wavering slightly, my boyfriend has just boarded his plane. He will be here in the next 24 hours. What should I tell him? The detective's expression softened. The truth, Ms. Carter. It won't be easy, but he deserves to know everything that's happened. We can provide support for that conversation if you'd like. Eloise nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread at the thought of seeing Corey. As the interview at the police station concluded, Eloise felt emotionally drained but somewhat relieved to have shared her story. The detective closed his notebook and gave her a reassuring nod. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Carter, he said. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation based on your statement and the evidence we've gathered. For now, let's get you back to the hospital and your son, or do you prefer we escort you home to rest? Eloise nodded. To the hospital, please, officer. Her thoughts immediately turning to her baby. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a surge of energy at the prospect of reuniting with him. An officer led Eloise out of the station and into a waiting patrol car. As they drove through the evening streets back towards the hospital, Eloise's mind wandered to Corey. She pulled out her phone, remembering that she hadn't replied to his earlier message. Looking at the time, she realized that Corey must be offline right now. His flight from Vietnam would still be in the air for many more hours. The reality of the time difference and the long journey he faced hit her anew. She typed out a quick message nonetheless. Corey, so much has happened. I can't explain everything in a text. Please call me as soon as you land, no matter what time it is here. I love you. As she hit send, the patrol car pulled up to the hospital entrance. The officer accompanying her stepped out first, scanning the area before opening her door. Eloise appreciated the extra precaution, even if it made her nervous about potential threats. They made their way through the hospital corridors, which seemed quieter now in the late evening hours. As they approached the maternity ward, Eloise's heart began to race with anticipation of seeing her son again. Nurse Olivia was waiting for them, cradling the baby in her arms. Her face broke into a relieved smile when she saw Eloise. "Welcome back," she said softly. "Someone's been waiting for his mom." Eloise felt tears welling up in her eyes as she reached for her son. The weight of him in her arms felt right, grounding her after the emotional turmoil of the day. She pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, inhaling his sweet baby scent. "Has he been okay?" Eloise asked, her eyes never leaving her child's face. Olivia nodded. "He's been perfect. We've been giving him donated breast milk and he's been sleeping peacefully most of the time." As Eloise cradled her son, Olivia glanced at her watch. "My shift is ending soon," she said softly. "I hate to leave you alone after everything that's happened." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "You know, the first 2 nights with a newborn is often the hardest. If you'd like, I could come home with you and help out. I could show you a few things about caring for him, maybe give you a chance to rest until your boyfriend arrives." Eloise looked up at Olivia, touched by the offer. The thought of facing the night alone with her newborn, especially after the day's events, was daunting. "Are you sure?" she asked. "You've already done so much." Olivia smiled warmly. I'm sure it's the least I can do. Grateful for the support, Eloise nodded. Olivia, Eloise said, her voice thick with emotion, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You saved my son and you saved my life. Olivia paused, her eyes meeting Eloise's. I just did what was right, she said softly. I'm so glad it all worked out. With the decision made, Olivia spoke to the police officers about the change in plans. After a brief discussion, it was agreed that they would escort both Eloise and Olivia to Eloise's apartment, ensuring their safety. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Eloise felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She was eager to be in her own space, away from the clinical environment that held so many difficult memories. Yet, the thought of returning to her apartment, where everything was set up for a baby she thought she'd lost, brought a fresh wave of emotion. The police officers led them to a waiting car, vigilant as they scanned the surroundings. Eloise held her son close, while Olivia carried a bag of supplies the hospital had provided. As they drove through the quiet night streets, Eloise found comfort in Olivia's presence and the knowledge that she wouldn't have to face this first night alone. You know, with everything that's happened, I don't think I've heard you mention your son's name yet. Have you thought of one? Eloise looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms, a wave of emotion washing over her. Actually, she said softly, Corey and I had chosen a name months ago. We wanted to be prepared. She paused, her finger gently tracing her son's cheek. We decided on Miles Asher Carter. Olivia's eyes lit up. That's a beautiful name. Does it have a special meaning? Eloise nodded, her voice filled with warmth as she explained, Miles means soldier or merciful, and Asher means blessed or happy. We chose it because, well, he's our miraculous and merciful child. The words caught in her throat as she realized how true they had become. After everything that had happened, her son truly was a miracle. Olivia reached over and squeezed Eloise's hand. It's perfect, she said. Hello, Miles, she added softly, addressing the sleeping baby. As if in response to her words, the baby stirred in his sleep, his tiny hand grasping her finger. Eloise felt her heart swell with love and protectiveness. Whatever challenges the night might bring, she had support, and her son was safe in her arms. It was a small step, but an important one, on the path to their new life together. We've been through quite an adventure already, haven't we, little one? Eloise murmured to him. But we're together now, and that's what matters. Your daddy Corey will be here soon, and we're going to be a family. No matter what happens, no matter what any test says, you are loved, you are wanted, you are ours. The police officers in the front seat exchanged a glance, their stern expressions softening slightly at the tender moment they had witnessed. As they continued their journey through the quiet city streets, Eloise felt a sense of peace wash over her. Despite the chaos and trauma of the past day, this moment, naming her son, claiming him as her own, felt right. It was a small but significant step towards the future she had dreamed of, a future that was now within reach for the tiny boy named Miles Asher Carter.